some parts. Once you are American, they look like us.
Anywhere you like, I'm okay. So, Hello, good morning everyone. If I could please ask everyone to take a seat. We will start the session very soon now. Okay, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Decarbonising Transport session, which is a 9 o'clock slot. We were fearing an empty room, but this is not happening. So we are very thankful for your early start and joining this session. I'm Elisabeth Windisch. I'm the co-lead of the ITF Transport Research Program. Before we start with the panel discussion, I wanted to give you a short overview of what the Decarbonising Transport initiative at the ITF actually is and what the progress has been so far over the last 6-7 years since 2016 when the initiative has started. So the DT initiative was launched in 2016 after the Paris Agreement, and the objective of this whole initiative is to help countries meet the transport decarbonisation ambitions, the ITF member countries, but also beyond. So this is really an initiative that goes beyond the sole ITF membership. We do this by providing analytical assistance, by using the in-house research team that we have developed over the last decades, and especially also the modelling tools that we have developed at the ITF over the last decade, which allow us to really provide quantitative evidence to our member countries in terms of what decarbonising transport measures can actually bring in terms of CO2 reduction. The Decarbonising Transport Initiative is basically a collection of different projects which we have clustered into 5 different work streams. First of all, we work on so-called progress tracking, which means that we track the nationally determined contributions that are submitted to the UNFCCC continuously in the frame of the Paris Agreement process. We carry out in-depth sectoral reports where we assess what transport subsectors can do in order to achieve transport emission reductions in their subsector, be it aviation, be it road transport, be it urban transport, or any other transport subsector. We carry out focus studies where we look at specific transport measures to see what the impacts are in terms of CO2 reductions, in terms of equity impacts, in terms of transport demand impacts, and so on. And then a very big work stream is also the so-called pathway development, where we help regions, countries, or cities develop pathways to meet the transport decarbonisation ambitions. And I will come to this in a bit later. And then the very last point, the very last work stream is what we call policy dialogue. And this is the work stream where we organize events, workshops, and meetings where the aim is to bring together policymakers with other transport stakeholders so that we can create a common understanding what the issues actually are and how we can tackle them together in order to overcome the transport decarbonisation challenge. And the event today is obviously part of this policy dialogue work stream. Now, what has the DT initiative at the ITF done so far in terms of specific numbers? The ITF team has carried out more than 25 projects since the DT initiative launched in 2016. We have more than 40 outputs that are available to download for free from our website. We have organized more than 60 events, be it at the summit, be it at the COP, at any other UNFCCC events, or be it project workshops, where the aim always is to bring together policymakers with other transport stakeholders, and often simply also the civil society to create awareness. We have launched a so-called Transport Climate Action Directory, which is also available on our website, where you can find more than 80 policy measures that can guide policymakers in terms of how they can reduce transport carbon emissions in their specific economies. You can find the information on what CO2 impacts are, what cost implications are, what other effects such policy measures may have. It's a tool free to use, and has helped policymakers around the world to shape the transport decarbonisation plans. We have one so-called NDC tracker on our website that tracks on a monthly basis the new NDC submissions that come in, and that assesses what transport content these NDC submissions actually have and what these submissions may mean for the transport sector. And we have published 4 ITF Transport Outlooks. This is our biannual flagship publication, which focus very specifically on transport and climate change. So this, in the last 4 editions, has been the main focus of these publications. And the very last one, the most recent one, is the Transport Outlook 2023, which is being launched today, actually still this morning, and I invite you already now to attend the session where you will hear more about this Transport Outlook at 11 o'clock, also in this room. And then the ITF obviously produces many more reports on other topics, not necessarily addressing transport and climate change. However, in all our work that we are doing currently, transport and climate change is always a matter of discussion, and it's always included in our reports and in all our discussions and thinking. So in any other ITF outputs that may not be branded an IDT initiative, you will also be able to find very insightful findings for transport decarbonisation. I want to give you 2 highlights of ongoing work. One is our work with emerging economies. So here we are currently working on 3 projects. One is the so-called Decarbonising Transport in Emerging Economies project, where we work with Argentina, Azerbaijan, India, and Morocco. And we help them develop decarbonisation pathways that will bring the economies, the transport sectors on a pathway that will meet the Paris Agreement goals. India is here underlined because we actually have a second, more dedicated project where the ITF works together with a consortium. It's led by the German GIZ. It's the so-called NDC-TIA project, a project that focuses on China, Vietnam, and India, and the ITF is covering largely the India component. So we have a very big focus and close collaboration with India in our ongoing work. A second project is the so-called Sustainable Infrastructure Program in Asia, where the objective is the same. It is led by the OECD because it covers all sectors, and the ITF covers the transport component of this project. Here we work with Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and the Philippines. And what comes out of this study is obviously always is, okay, we know what the transport decarbonisation measures should be for these countries. We have looked at the very specificities of these countries at their starting points. We know what they should be doing, but how do we finance it is always a question, a very obvious question. And this is why in many of the workshops we lead in these countries, we invite development banks to be there to discuss with the local stakeholders what actions can be taken to access finance and to overcome this finance barrier. And this is also one of the reasons why we decided to dedicate today's session on financing the transition to clean transport. A second highlight is the ITF Transport Outlook, which I have already mentioned. The 2023 edition is launched today, and is based on cutting-edge global transport demand and emission modelling, and it gives you an outlook of transport decarbonisation scenarios to 2050. What is currently the demand? How will the transport demand evolve? And what measures do we have to put in place in order to make sure that we are actually on a Paris Alliance pathway? This is a publication that addresses the global community. It's not focused at specific countries, but you can find insights for any sub-regions of the world and discussions that are relevant for all kinds of stakeholders, be they in the transport sector, energy sector, finance sector, and so on. And we consider this as a conversation starter. Again, a tool to bring stakeholders from the different sectors together to make sure they collaborate and they all pull on the same string. Now, I want to close this presentation by giving you some findings and some food for thought that may start the discussion among the panel that we have today. So in the Transport Outlook 2023 that is launched today, we find that still, and despite all efforts already being put in place, global transport demand for both freight and passenger transport will roughly double by 2050. And this means that we're currently still not on track to meet the Paris climate goals. Rather, with the current measures, we achieve that CO2 emissions from the transport sector are kept in check, but they will not fall by a significant degree. If we want to be on a Paris Agreement aligned pathway, around 3/4 of the CO2 emission cuts in transport will likely come from so-called improved measures. These are measures related to technologies, to new vehicle technologies and to alternative fuels. We also find that global transport infrastructure investment needs are actually lower in a Paris-aligned pathway than under the current pathway. And I will leave it here and I will not tell you more, and I will not tell you what the actual number is and how much lower they are, because I really want to make sure you actually come to the 11 o'clock session in this room to listen to our presentations about the Transport Outlook and to even get a copy and maybe read more to find out what the number is and where it comes from. Then some more findings, more related to the finance aspect and emerging economies aspects. Finance needed to meet climate goals is estimated at trillions of US dollars annually until 2050. So far, we are seeing around 630 billion US dollars per year, and only a fraction of this goes to emerging economies. Also, over the past 5 years, emerging and developing economies have received less than 10% of the international funding that is required to support the transition to electric vehicles over the next 5 years. And with this, I would like to hand over to my colleague Olivia, who will moderate the panel and may use these statements or others to start the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So yeah, we're really honoured today to have a really varied panel to hear perspectives from Ana Maria Pinto from the Inter-American Development Bank, from Nicolas Pelletier from the World Bank, from Roland Werner from Uber. So we're getting this kind of multilateral development bank and private sector interest, and then also from our esteemed guests from ministerial guests from countries. So Mr. Lisa Mancu from Deputy Minister from South Africa, and Juan Carlos Munoz, Minister for Transport from Chile. So we really want to delve into how can we work together to really aggregate and leverage financing to accelerate the clean transport transition. And first, I'd like to hear a perspective from a country, so from Juan Carlos Munoz from Chile. Chile is showing real global leadership in the transition to clean transportation. You've made really ambitious statements backed up by action to transition away from internal combustion engine vehicles for both light, heavy-duty vehicles. So it'd be really interesting to hear about the actions that you're taking, any lessons that can be learned from other countries within the region, any lessons that you would like to pass on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Olivia, this is...
Oh.
Can you hear me?
I can give you mine.
That might be working now. So, thank you very much. In Chile, we have taken electromobility very seriously since our COP25 was supposed to be in Santiago in 2019, but much earlier, like 6 years ago, we started experiencing with electric buses. We bought the first 2 buses, and by then everyone was saying, well, they're too expensive. Would they really make sense in a hilly city like ours? And by now, after a very good experience at the very beginning, we have around over 1,900 electric buses operating in Santiago, which we understand it makes it the largest fleet worldwide outside from China. And we're very proud of this, and not only we're very proud, but it has allowed us to reduce pollution, of course, carbon emissions, and people are very happy with them. They're not just less pollutant, but also they provide a very comfortable ride. And of course they are more expensive than internal combustion engine buses, but we have found some ways in which we foster operators to buy them by providing them a larger contract. So if you were to buy an electric bus instead of a diesel bus, you will have a longer contract, and that by doing that, you'll have more years in which the cost reduction and the maintenance cost reductions because of your electric buses will be longer, and it's more convenient. This has also forced us to have very long terminals, very large terminals. We have terminals for around 250 electric buses in one part of the city. They require a lot of power, 8.8 thousand megawatts, which is a problem, of course, but we have been able to handle that. It's interesting to see how our bus operators, which maybe 15, 20 years ago, they would have very rough terminals, very informal. Now they have these amazing electric terminals. They feel so proud, and they have a lot of lessons that they have learned in the process on how to design these terminals adequately. So how many buses per charging spot? How do you charge them so that your batteries last longer? How do you charge it so that the cost of the operational cost is lower, because the electric fare is very different times of the day? And we see this also as an asset of the city that we are very happy to share with others, not only on the regulatory side, but also on the operational side of the private sector. So this is what we've done on the bus side. For cars, we have implemented some tax incentives, like if you were to buy a private car, you don't pay for the permit. The driving permit during the first 2 years, and it gets increased gradually until only by year 9 you pay the full driving permit. And also, something that I think is also very important, we have been very open to different technologies. So we're not saying we buy this or that electric technology. We're open to whatever it comes. We have just accepted also the Chinese norm for charging vehicles, and we think that will allow us to go deeper in terms of reducing the price of new vehicles. I should say this, that almost all of our 2,000 buses, electric buses, are Chinese. And it's not because we like Chinese buses, but because operators find them cheaper to buy, and because at the end they provide the same service that buses from other countries. So that's our lesson so far, and we would like to go deeper also into electric bikes for delivery, into other kind of vehicles, also in the mining industry. We would like to allow our factories, our companies, to transform diesel buses into electric. That's something we're working on. This forces us to go through the parliament to a new law that will allow us to do that, but we have some companies that are already doing it, and we think that will be also a very important step towards adopting electromobility faster.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Several examples there of where Chile is showing some real global leadership, and other countries can certainly learn from. So thank you. Now I'm going to move on to Deputy Minister Manku from South Africa. South Africa has, within your strategy, a 2050 net zero target. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the role of moving towards clean transport technologies and helping to achieve that goal, but also the different types of financing models that you're using to support that. Thanks.
Well, thank you. This thing doesn't like ministers.
Yes.
This technology doesn't like ministers. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Greetings from South Africa. You look too serious. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and all the panelists. Well, I think in South Africa, in general in Africa, we are certainly committed to all the goals and objectives of reduction of emissions to the extent that we are. But some of the things that we have done in South Africa is to develop what we call as a green transport strategy. This green transport strategy encompasses all modes of transport, broadly road, rail, aviation, and maritime. and also to give sort of framework that could encourage in the private sector how they could also contribute towards this. So one of the things we have already started is the introduction of alternative fuels, so that we make sure that as we receive fuels, either for aviation or roads, that we get less carbon emitting type of fuels. And I think it's forums like these where your big fuel or producing countries, we think the assistance that they can give to emerging economies and some of us is to produce less carbon emitting fuels as we export to countries like ours. We have also, as a country, through cabinet and through parliament, approved as late last year, 2022, what we call a road to rail strategy. What do we mean by that? We've got a lot of trucks on the road which are obviously producing or emitting a lot of gases and polluting. So the intention is to have as much cargo on the roads, because we are a country that is exporting a lot of chrome, coal, and other minerals. So we have trucks. Even this morning, I got a report that we've got trucks that are queuing to the extent of 20 kilometers, trying either to get to our ports or to the port of Beira in Mozambique. So our strategy says we must move freight from road to rail. And that we have just approved, and we are forcibly doing it. It's got its own challenges, but that's one of the things we are doing. Now, in the aviation sector, amongst others, in the main, we are looking at sustainable aviation fuels that are also able to assist us in achieving the goal that we have set ourselves for 2050. And lastly, in that area, before I move quickly to what instruments we are looking at in terms of financing these ideals, is looking at sulfur reduction, where we can phase out in the maritime bunker fueling. We are a big maritime country. We command or we control, or our coastline is around 3,000 kilometers, which is quite huge. So there's a lot of countries that traverse our seas in terms of maritime. So we are putting through legislation in Parliament, aligning also with international legislation and International Maritime Organization prescripts to make sure that in that space we produce less sulfur. Now you ask me as to what financing models or tools we are implementing there. Now, in line with our strategy, we have what we call a Green Climate Fund, which is an international fund, and mostly of our funds are more reliant on international funds or international donors in terms of that. So that fund is something that we are working on. It's subject to each and every participant in our space, context of transport. We have to put up a sustainable project that shows that we're doing it, then we can be able to access that fund. The other fund that we are using as an instrument is the Green Mobility Facility for Africa. It's also a fund that is available to us. We also do have a couple of bilaterals and multilateral agreements with like-minded countries, where we can say, how do we assist each other to be able to achieve this? One of them is a local fund, KFW, which is particularly interested in the non-motorized transport space. We are not big in non-motorized transport like many of you in Europe because of the topography. Our countries are very mountainous, so to cycle there is a struggle. So I see many people who are cycling here. Come and cycle in South Africa. If you are used to cycling 10 kilometers, you won't do 5 kilometers because of our topography. Now, the minister from Chile spoke about buses. We also have been rolling out in 13 cities bus rapid transit systems. as part of our integrated transport plans. So we are forcing these buses, majority of them we are prescribing as to how many must be on alternative fuels, so that as we move mass people, we are able to reduce the footprint that they are producing. So some of the things, again, in the financing that might not be direct from government is partnership with big car manufacturers that would put in place, for instance, electric charging facilities in malls, in parking spaces, and so forth. So that might not be direct investment by government, but it also helps. So last but not least, of course, the tax regime is something we're also in, but we're also looking at subsidies to those people that are producing what will be less carbon emitting transportation systems. So I will stop there because I'm a politician. You know, politicians speak a lot. So, but I think we have covered quite a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Mankiw. It's great to hear a really comprehensive overview of all of the different measures that South Africa is taking to reduce your emissions from transport sector. Now we're going to hear from multilateral development banks, and I think it was great that Mr. Mankiw mentioned some of the facilities and funds that are available to you in considering how to accelerate clean transport. So perhaps first we'll go to Nicolas Peltier. It would be great to hear a little bit about the role that you see of your organization, the World Bank, in supporting these clean transport transitions, what funds you have available, and also what advice you have to countries who are seeking funding from you in terms of how they can set out their business case and their needs. Thanks.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. Thank you very much, Olivia, and thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel. I'm really glad that ITF is starting this summit with the topic of transport decarbonisation, because what we see at the World Bank is that this is becoming our #1 driver of the work we do in transport. And there are some good reasons for that. No, I don't need to elaborate too much on the why, but we know that transport-related emissions represent 23% of global GHG emissions. We know that they are rising. And there are some reasons for that. As countries develop, they tend to motorize more. You know, we did some studies at the World Bank showing that when per capita GDP doubles, the number of vehicles increases by 40% now. And so, you know, we have about 1 billion cars in the world today. By 2040, we could very well end up with 2 billion cars in the world. So that's why at the World Bank, we are trying to help countries to change their mobility pattern, and move towards more sustainable transportation. We manage a portfolio of about $36 billion in transport, and we try to measure what's the proportion of that financing that supports climate goals. We use a methodology that is common to all the multilateral development banks, and about 60% of our financing goes into climate-friendly transportation, but half for mitigation and half for adaptation. We want to do more. We know that we'll have to do more because as of July 1st, all the development partners have to ensure that they are Paris aligned, and so they need to make sure that in every financing, any operation that they support, this is consistent with the net zero trajectories of countries and with the Paris Agreement. So that's a very important change that I expect will drive us in doing more. To help us accompany this transition, we've set up a new facility called the Global Facility to Decarbonize Transport that was created under the UK presidency at COP26. This is still a relatively modest fund, but the goal is really to work upstream, and be able to support countries as they design policies, they design programs that can move towards climate-friendly transportation. We follow the Avoid, Shift and Improve framework. Elizabeth mentioned that in her presentation. Avoid unnecessary trip, for example, by densifying cities, bringing people closer to their jobs, shifting to cleaner modes of transport, like public transport, like rail transport, and improving the carbon intensity of every mode. And we heard your conclusion that that pillar is particularly important. And that includes moving to net zero, electrifying transport, moving to sustainable alternative fuels. We know the financing needs are enormous. I think Elizabeth mentioned the figure of $630 billion annually between now and 2030. This is huge. And we know that even if we combine all the resources of the multilateral development banks, this will be only a portion of that. And this is why we have to think about this notion of how we cascade, how we leverage, each time we spend $1 of financing from our organization, how can we leverage the maximum amount of private financing? The one that requires thinking about risk sharing agreement, new way of financing projects and working with the private sector. It means also beyond specific projects, working on the investment climate. What are the policies that can improve financing conditions and the investment climate for the private sector to come in. So I'll stop there, but this is a bit what we are trying to do at the World Bank now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. It's great to hear a little bit more about that wider financing landscape and the role that multilateral development banks play in that. And then I guess the same questions to Ana Maria Pinto. So what activities is the Inter-American Development Bank doing to support the clean transport transition, and what advice would you have for governments seeking financing? Thank you.
Thank you, Livia. Thank you, Livia, and thank you so much to the ITF for the invitation to the Inter-American Development Bank to be here today. We're truly honored to be chairing this panel with such distinguished panelists. And I want to build on what Nicolas said, because of course we share the same objectives, and I would like just maybe to give a little bit of a picture of what's happening in Latin America from our point of view. So yes, we do financing, and that's one of our priorities, but we are a small part of the whole of the investment that is done in Latin America and the Caribbean. So our efforts for helping the countries in the climate transition are focused on enabling the regulatory and policy environment for the climate transition to happen. And although we see a commitment of the countries on the general goal of course, of working towards a decarbonization of the sector and fulfilling all the climate change goals, we see a very different development in the countries. We have countries like Chile leading the climate transition and with a very good institutional, regulatory, and policy framework, but there are other countries that still don't have NDCs, for example. And those that have NDCs, they don't have a specific transport plans or action plans. So in order for us to be effective on how we do that funding, we need to help governments on how to really prioritize what are those actions of the transport sector that can help work towards the decarbonization. And in Latin America and Caribbean, the proportion of the transport sector is 40%. So it's even more important, like you were talking about the global 23, well, in Latin America it's 40 for the transport sector. So that makes it even more important to define those paths for the transport sector. So we have the example, for example, in Chile, we're working with the government on helping define that strategic plan for the transport sector. And saying this, as well, we're seeing a current, current needs and priority from governments beyond mitigation, more in adaptation. And although transport is the 40%, Latin America and the Caribbean accounts just for the 8% of the total emissions, like globally. And on the other hand, it's one of the regions more affected by the impacts of climate change. And because we still have such a big infrastructure gap, we're still building some of the infrastructure that some of the regions that Europe built years ago. So the challenge as well is how we fill that gap that is estimated on 3% of our GDP for the next 10 years at least. So how do we build that infrastructure in a resilient way? So a lot of our work as well is working with the countries, not just, as I say, in the financing, but defining the tools, the technology, the innovation that needs to be put in place for building that infrastructure more resilient, as well helping mitigate. And as Nicolas was saying, is how we align these projects to the goals of the Paris alignment. And I want to end, of course, saying yes, we finance. What is our role? Well, we channel resources of many funds. We help countries apply to those funds. But I will say that our main role in financing is helping with those strategic pilots and investments that can help set up like the stage for what will be like countrywide programs, as Minister Munoz was mentioning. And I think electromobility is a good case. But there are many other areas where the clean transition needs to address, no? And in the follow-up question, hopefully I can tell you a little bit more of what we're doing on electromobility, building on what Minister Munoz outlined before.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear about the activities and also, to have a bit of a discussion around the kind of infrastructure piece specifically and how we mobilize financing into that clean infrastructure, and also the mention of resilience as well, which is really important. How do we bake that in at the same time as keeping our eyes on the Paris Agreement goals, but ensuring that all new infrastructure is resilient to the impacts of climate change? Thanks. So now we're going to hear a private sector perspective. We've got Roland Werner from Uber. It'd be really good to hear from you about the steps that Uber is taking to support the deployment of zero-emission vehicles in emerging markets, and also kind of what gives you the market confidence to invest in some of these markets as well.
Thank you very much, and really many thanks for hosting us here today and having this important discussion. 10 years ago, I was the first time at this conference when I was a regional minister in this region here hosting it now. And it's amazing for me to see with the examples from South Africa, from Chile, and everywhere around how much we moved ahead already. And if I like to give this example with this sharing microphone, that's in the end the business we do. Maybe it's also one approach that we might not need 6 cars in the future, but maybe have one and share it. And looking at the charging infrastructure, maybe it's also a question of charging, but I come to this later. We as a company, we are absolutely committed to go full carbon neutral by 2040. We believe this is a really global mission for every one of us. And it's quite ambitious goal because there's a lot behind to be done still, and we talked already about some of these elements. We plan to be in the first step in 2030 already in the US, Canada, and Europe carbon neutral. And the exciting thing is at the moment we have roughly 45,000 cars in those countries offering carbon neutral full electric experience. And by this, already 31 million people globally made at least once this experience via the Uber platform to be driven around full electric. And I think it's also important to show that people need to learn it, need to understand it, how it works, how it is, also with regard to comfort, very silent. We are extremely keen on bringing it in a very high-speed track to more and more countries. We've heard the example from Chile that on one side, really congratulations to getting all these EV buses, but we know also in many other countries, in many other places, we are all still struggling to get enough vehicles. So I think on one side, it's always the question to get enough vehicles. Right while we sit here, our colleagues in India are announcing a big news that we will roll out a big EV project for India with, in partnership with Tata Motors, bring 25,000 6,000 EVs within 3 years into India. So we are really moving ahead very fast, but it is still a long way to go. And this, on one side, it's the financial questions that need to be resolved. There we are partnering with lots of financial institutions to build tailor-made solution for our partners that bring the cars on the street. We work in cooperation, as I just mentioned, with many car manufacturers to open up supply for those who drive the riders. But last but not least, and I come back now to the charging of the microphone, and that's also a challenge for cars, and would be also interesting to hear maybe also later about also how this works with the buses. Because what we see is, and we have seen it first when we explored it in London, where we are on a very fast track already in electrifying our mobility offer in London, that very often the charging infrastructure isn't there where you need it, or maybe it is not in the right shape where you need it. So it's a question on where do you really have the cars and need to charge them, and at which hours. So in some places you might need a higher ratio of fast charger. In other places, maybe where, for example, in our case, some of the drivers are living, they can really use the slow charger. But we have seen in many places there is a complete mismatch on the infrastructure also. It's challenging because it's a complete building up of something new for every one of us in all of our own realities in our countries. But we developed a tool where we can use all the data that we can leverage, assuming that we would have someday 100% full electric cars on the platform, and then find out where it's needed. So we have in dozens of cities already a partnership with cities to use this data. It's a data tool. We are currently also rolling it out in India and in many other places. And there we also hope to be able to give a strong contribution to the society to help scaling it up in the right way. Because again, when I remember 10 years ago, I was already opening some of the charging facilities. And sometimes when I see them today, they're not so often used. So it's really still an issue, and there we will also help to deliver a share. But now, sharing again the microphone.
Thank you very much. A great analogy. And I think perhaps that takes us on to a bit of a discussion that I was keen to have today about the role of the energy community as well, and the synergies between the transport and the energy transition. And perhaps we can just have a bit of a discussion about what are the asks and needs of the transport sector as we decarbonise from the energy sector, and how can we best work with them to synergise, to leverage more financing into transport. So I thought I could come back to you, Minister Munoz. I was very interested in hearing about the e-bus deployment, and you were talking about these big depots. Could you say a little bit about the kind of how you're working with the energy sector to support, I guess, the deployment of those e-buses?
Well, yeah, we are working very strongly, not only with the bus operators, but also with the energy sector. Now, I would like to make one step back. It's very important that at the end that we don't miss the focus. And the focus here is to decarbonize. And cities not only need to be decarbonized, they also need to have less pollution, less noise. Then we need to solve traffic problems. We have a lot of health issues. We lack urban space. There's many elements in which we need to address in our cities, and the countries are getting more and more urbanized. In Chile, we have 90% people, 90% living in cities. And when you think of electromobility, which I think is great, it doesn't address most of the crises I've just mentioned. It addresses mostly one, which is the decarbonization. I like to think of this as, well, if we need to reduce the carbon emissions per year per city, well, it depends on how many people live in the city, how many trips each of us do, what's the distance of each of the trips, how much energy do we need in each of the trips to move each kilometer, and then emissions per energy. So notice that if we move 20% of our vehicles to electricity, it will be the same effect that if all our trips are 20% shorter, or if we do 20% less trips, or if we move 20% of our trips to bicycles. So I think that by focusing only in electricity, I think we may be missing the opportunity to address all of the crises together. And don't misunderstand me, we're really moving ahead with electromobility in all of our possibilities, not only in terms of electric vehicles, also green hydrogen, and we're even thinking now about synthetic fuels, and we have a plant in the south of the country that is developing synthetic fuels. But I think that we need to take a little bit of distance and address all of the crises together, and therefore all the factors that at the end will be key on the decarbonization efforts. So the way we do it in Chile in terms of the electric buses or the buses is that we have two schemes. In one scheme, we have the operator being the one that is requested to bring the buses and at the same time operate them. And we have also another scheme, and we're now in the moment where we can compare both, in which there's one company that will be the one providing the buses, and there will be another one that will be the one that will be operating them. And it's interesting because in this second scheme, the good thing is that if the operator is not very good, you can replace the operator much faster than if the operator also is the one that has the buses. You have much stronger commitments with an operator that also has the buses. Now, the problem with this interesting scheme is that at the end, in Chile at least, it has proven to be much more expensive than if the same company is the one to hold the buses and operate them. So, and I think that the full benefits of this idea, which I think is innovative, of separating the two elements, will be better understood after a long term, let's say 10 years, and look back and say, was it worth it? Because I think that the contracts won't grow as much as when you have one operator that does both. They have a much stronger position if they have the buses and operate them. And also with buses, one problem we don't know yet is how are we gonna how the contracts that we have signed with operators will work when batteries start to get less and less productive. That's something that we don't know yet. I think that the success of our policies will be better understood probably in 7 or 10 more years. And we're always looking at and trying to look ahead and discussing how can we improve our contracts. We are, as I said before, we have a scheme in which if you were to bring diesel buses, you have a shorter contract than if you have electric buses. And we have a commitment as a country that by 2035, all new buses and all new medium vehicles to be sold in Chile will be electric. And by 2040, all buses operating in the country should be electric, and so on and so forth. We have several commitments on different sectors of mobility in order to improve, to move towards zero emissions. Instead of saying electric, I should have said zero emissions. We don't know what technologies will be seen in the future, but the whole point here is to turn into zero emissions. In Chile, our system has subsidies provided by the state, but the operators, private companies are the one to invest in terminals. They are the one that get contracts with power companies in order to adequately design the terminals, how much energy they will need. And we've realized that some of our terminals are really thirsty in terms of energy. And they usually are located in areas where there's lots of housing. So the issue of how this is compatible with the energy that those houses would demand during the day is very important. I think there's a lot of regulatory needs for this combination to be feasible. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Minister. It was, I'm really grateful for you for taking a bit of a step back and focusing also on some of the wider benefits of these transitions and the need to look at it as a wider system transformation, as Elizabeth set out in her slides. The kind of improve element of moving to electrification or clean fuels is just one part, and we must look at the kind of wider shift that will support our communities as well. I heard from your initial intervention, Minister Mankiw, that there's a lot of focus that you're taking on shifting towards clean fuels. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what that looks like and how you're kind of working with the energy community in order to support that shift there.
Well, thank you very much once more. I think I agree with the minister here from Chile about that the challenges we face, not only in cities, but as countries, particularly developing countries. While the focus here is reduction or decarbonizing in the transport sector, but we've got huge problems. For instance, Nicola speaks about trying to move issue of less movement. In our case, it's not that easy because where we come from, apartheid put the most people furthest from working places. You need to move those people. So some of our biggest challenges, how do we reorganize our communities? How do we bring people closer to working places so that they can have to travel less? They don't have the luxury of using alternative transport like non-motorized transport and others because they are very far. We've got communities that live between 20 and 30 kilometers to get to working places. So for them, that it's a luxury. But as government, we have a responsibility to decarbonize. So when you talk energy community, I would rather look at alternative energy communities, whatever it is, whether it's gas, whether it's hybrid, but whatever we can use, those mixes. Because again, if you look at our supply, our demand and supply of energy in the form of electricity, we have our own challenges. Because where do you prioritize? Do you put in electricity in people, they can keep themselves warm and be able to light up for children to study? Or do you use that energy to charge up a vehicle? So our challenges become very, very different. So that's why forums like these, we can share some of our experiences and hopefully get that. Now, one of the things that I believe that we can leverage from and be assisted, for instance, in South Africa, we don't have a manufacturing of buses capacity. Most of the buses we import. Mercedes-Benz, Marco Polo from Italy, MAN, not Italy, Brazil, and so forth and so forth. Now, most of these bus or manufacturing companies, MOEs, they've got finance models that they would use to assist these countries that are buying either our bus systems. How do you then assist us in making sure that your finances are amenable or taking us towards making sure that the buses that we sell are alternative energy users, you know? So that management of those tools becomes very, very important. Now, in our case also, it's a matter of behavior change because, again, as I said, without over-elaborating, we've got people staying from the furthest places of work. These people are forced to travel by car, by bus, and whatever the case may be. So that is why our green transport strategy becomes very critical to us. The BRT, for instance, we try and densify communities along routes. We have seen, for instance, with the development of our speed train in Gauteng, where we've seen a lot of development coming closer to the rail tracks. What type of building materials do we use there, you know, so that we can use less energy and be able to spread this? So you will hear that my answer is not directed at transport because as countries, as cities, we are facing huge problems beyond just decarbonizing in the space of transport. But of course, the type of buildings that we take up begin to help us. So we've got more green building that we are coming up with. And the issue of my colleague from Uber who's talking about that infrastructure that we roll out. we've got long distances to travel. From Pretoria, the capital city, to Polokwane in the north. I've got a colleague who's a provincial MEC or minister there of transport, is more than 200 kilometers. Where do you put your gas filling places there? Where do you put your electrical chargers there? So it becomes a totally different, hence the hybrid model or the batteries and so forth becomes there. So in terms of the energy community, communities, really for us, it's more leaning towards your finance company. What models, what packages can you bring together that support government policies to make sure that we are able to move quicker or transition quicker in terms of the clean energy that we use? The uptake again of hybrid cars, and maybe let me say this, if we could have less cars which are carbon emitting cars being exported to countries like ours when they're already used, it will be better for us. So we face these huge challenges where our level of development, while we are pushing very hard, is not to the extent to which many European countries would be. And can I leave it there?
Yes,
Thank you.
of course. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive overview. And I guess if I was to reflect a little bit on both what yourself and Juan Carlos Munoz just outlined, is really just the government decision making that you have in terms of balancing the needs of your population, as well as keeping your sights on the goals of the Paris Agreement, balancing the amount of energy, the clean energy that's available and where that needs to go, as well as the kind of innovative approaches that you have to consider. So yeah, it's certainly not straightforward, but I think it's great to have a conversation and to start to pinpoint some of these challenges. Maybe moving on to Ana Maria, it would be great to hear a little bit from you about the interlinkages with the energy sector, but also perhaps if you can just reflect on some financing models as well that you've been considering that really support the clean transport transition. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And the first thing that maybe I would like to reflect is that the whole, clean transition, and talking specifically about electromobility, means now more than ever that the transport sector works in a multi-sectoral approach. We've been so busy, at least in Latin America, building infrastructure, and our policy a lot focus on how to build that infrastructure, or in the cities, how to get those systems running, that sometimes, as Minister was saying, we need a more holistic approach on how we face transport. So that entails that means that we have to reach out from the policy-making side, but as well to the private sector. And by this, I mean lots of the climate agenda discussion at the moment, and I think lots of us agree, is led by the climate change, departments or sectors, and the energy sectors. But at least in Latin America, we account for the 40%, as I said before. So how do we have a more active role on defining what that climate change, not just takers, but we have to be more, have a more leading role on defining those actions, because at the end, we are going to drive the change. So regarding the electromobility agenda, what does this mean? This means that we need to be having a two-way conversation about, of course, where that clean energy comes from, what is the source, what going to be the supply. Do we really going to have the supply that we need for the whole? So we doing all these projects, and how is the supply going to, and you were saying it as well, going to cover that potential demand that the sector is going to bring. And we need to work in the whole value chain of the whole process. That comes to the charging station, for example, the building infrastructure, and more importantly, or as important, and Minister was mentioning, who and when is the private sector able to provide the vehicles or the units that we're going to need. So for that, from the transport sector, we have to have that relationship with all these actors. The energy sector, we at the bank has a practice. We have a practice with our energy division and our climate change division on taking to the authorities and the governments an integral solution, a holistic solution, no? And I think that's a big responsibility that we have from the banks, how to enable that. Because sometimes at the government as well level, each government works in silos. And from the sector, from the multilaterals, have that role as well of bringing that holistic solutions. And I think something important that Minister Munoz mentioned, we're talking beyond buses. Buses is a percentage. We're going to do it, we need to talk about all these private vehicles that Nicolas was saying are growing in Latin America, where motorization rates still quite low, and it's just projected to increase. So how are we doing that transition for those vehicles, or for the cargo fleet? The cargo fleet accounts for a very important amount of the emissions, and still there are no technical solutions completely defined for how we're going to do the transition of these fleets. We're talking more about hydrogen, but there's a lot still of research and development to kind of foster that. So, so I would say, yeah, we need to work with the energy community, getting more a leading role on defining the agenda of the climate change transition at the government level, but as well in the international arena as well. We need to work in the whole value chain to make this feasible beyond pilots. I mean, I think we're doing well with the pilots, but how it's going to scale up. And we need to work not just with the energy sector, but with the finance ministers. We're talking about subsidies and how we're going to really allocate the resources where we can be more effective.
Thank you. That's really comprehensive thinking, as you said, about the whole value chain, the role of pilots, the role of bringing in the energy community, but also thinking about financing and the finance ministers. Yeah, what I'm getting from the discussion so far today is we need to be talking to everyone, right? We need to break down the silos, and we need to think about all of the different angles that can really support this transition. Moving on to you again, Nicolas Pelletier, on how the World Bank sees your working. I know you've been doing some work, for example, with the Collective for Clean Transport Finance and looking at innovative models for scaling up financing for clean transport transition. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about collaboration and also work with the energy community if you'd like to too.
Yes, thank you, Olivia. Perhaps starting with the collaboration between transport and energy. And it's interesting because 10 years ago, these were sectors that were on very different tracks. Now, I must say, in transport, we collaborated more with our colleagues from urban development, not that much with energy colleagues. This is changing very quickly, and the driver of that is this electrification agenda. Today, we are bringing the energy conversation in this transport forum. It's interesting because the parallel to the ITF is the Clean Energy Ministerial. And I had the opportunity to attend the last CEM in Pittsburgh last year, and 40% of the agenda of energy minister was transport related. So that was really interesting. You can see that collaboration space increasing. And one of the reasons for that is the importance of the charging infrastructure. It's really one of the most important driver if we want to accelerate the electrification of transport. And we did some research at the banks showing that if we have $1 to spend in subsidizing the electrification of transport, it's 7 times more effective putting it in the charging infrastructure than subsidizing the direct acquisition of vehicles. So, for policymakers, it's really something important to think about. The other important element is we shouldn't think about the energy transition and the electrification of transport to be sequential. I mean, we have no time. If we want to reach our climate ambitions, the two of them have to go hand in hand. And we also did some research that it actually makes total sense, because even if your energy is not yet clean and the bulk of it comes from fossil fuel sources, because there is a huge difference in efficiency between electric engine and internal combustion engines, it's even with energy sources that are essentially from fossil fuel, you get a benefit, a net benefit in emissions per kilometer travel. No? So let's not wait. Let's start, and those two transitions have to go hand in hand. Now, regarding the broader collaboration and with the finance community, it's really important because, as we were saying, I mean, the needs are enormous, and we really need to embrace this leveraging agenda that requires partnering with the private sector, understanding what are the most effective instruments. Right now, there are some really interesting innovations happening around the world in using risk-sharing instruments, backstopping instruments, blended finance, that can have that leveraging effect. I mean, what India is doing right now to spur the development of their electric 2- and 3-wheelers by working with the local financial sector so that they can reduce the risk perception and align the financing terms for an electric vehicle vis-à-vis an internal combustion engine alternative is really interesting, I think. And if that works, this is something that could go to scale elsewhere in the world. So we, at the World Bank, we are trying to monitor this very closely because since we are a global organization, we see our role as disseminating those innovations. So if that works in India, let's bring this to Africa, let's bring this to LAC and promote this cross-fertilization. There is another interesting innovation that is happening, is the aggregation, the possibility to aggregate and create markets by going to scale. Some cities have started the electrification agenda by procuring a few hundred electric buses. It's a great way to start, but if you can pool the demand from various cities and then procure a larger number, you can really change the market. And you can even at some point develop a local market for electric vehicles. I mean, that's what India is trying to do right now. They have this, what they call the Grand Challenge, where they are aiming at procuring 50,000 electric buses. And that's a game changer in the EV industry. So these are the innovations that we need to disseminate. I think what Chile and Colombia have been doing also in changing the institutional model for operation and ownership of e-buses is really something interesting that is worth looking at. So yeah, there are various. It's really an area of a lot of innovation at the moment, and we all need to learn one from another.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. So yeah, lots and lots of different types of models that can be deployed there. So yeah, I guess, as you said, it's how do we ensure that we disseminate best practice and help to aggregate demand to support the transition globally. Thank you. Roland, it'd be interesting to hear if you have any kind of further reflections. You really kind of led the way with talking about infrastructure and energy and also about pilot programs in India, but do you have any further reflections on collaboration?
Yeah, first of all, I think, as far as I understand, we all agree that it needs a holistic approach. It is not just the one solution that fits for everything. Maybe a similar solution might look very different in one country than in another country. And what we truly also believe is, and so when we speak about 2040, we like to be fully carbon neutral. It means electric vehicles, but it means also partnership with transit. It means also micromobility with electric bicycles, electric scooters in city areas, not in the rural areas so much maybe. And I think this is really the way to go. At the same time, I think also really we need financing, also public funding for charging infrastructure and so on. But again, also as I said, at the right place. And this is definitely a challenge because, as you also mentioned, in 7 years, maybe some learnings might look different as today. And this is, I think, the pure truth. And I think it's also important that we are all aware of this. But last but not least, it needs also right regulations. Because, for example, we have a product which is called Uber Share, kind of pooling service. It's quite amazing because, as with the microphones, you can share maybe a car and have 2, 3 people in a car or even more. But then there are some countries, Germany, that makes this nearly impossible for us to roll out because there's a regulation that makes it for private company impossible to do. And at the same time, we have another regulation where cars sometimes need to drive around city centers empty without passengers because there's a very peculiar regulation in the law and which is especially challenging for battery electric car where you have a limited capacity and then if some trips you need to do empty. So I think we also need to talk about this, how we can unlock more opportunities for these kind of new ways of mobility. And yes, I personally believe the public transit as also a form of sharing is a core pillar of this, but it might not meet all the demands of people that sometimes have at some hours, maybe especially late at night, some more individual mobility needs. So I really think bringing back together the public sector and private companies is maybe a good way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're just coming towards the end of this kind of panel discussion, but I just thought it would be good to have kind of a quick 1-minute reflection from each of the panelists. And I'd just be keen to hear from you. How do we take this discussion forward? Because I think we've pinpointed a lot of issues and a lot of solutions through the discussion today. But how do we continue to break down some of these silos and to support collaboration coming together? And how can the ITF and other international fora support that as well?
Well, thank you. Just as final comment, I would like to mention that the process we have followed in making this amazing electromobility path in electric buses has been supported in many ways by multilateral banks. So it's good to thank and to say that by following this trajectory, we haven't been alone, and we're very proud about the process we have followed. We have also have bonds from the Treasury Ministry in Chile that has allowed operators to move ahead. Very often, and now we have the challenge of making this happen in other cities in Chile, where they are very informal still, and for them, turning their fleet into electric, it looks like an Everest to climb. Even though at the other side of the Everest, there might be lower operational costs, lower maintenance costs. So the issue of how you help them go ahead and turn into electric, I think it's very important. That's why I think that every effort to make the financial cost, either because the buses are cheaper, because maybe you can change your diesel bus into an electric bus, or maybe you have some financial support, is very relevant. And regarding companies like Uber, I would be very glad and very happy if this effort of turning US and Europe and the Northern Hemisphere into carbon neutral by 2030 has also put some, not only Uber, but other companies, some face or some eyes also in the developing world. In the developing world, the fleet that is operated by, especially for the delivery companies, it's really polluting. In our case, very often the delivery companies use a bike equipped with a 2-stroke engine. And this is very noisy. It pollutes 100 times the norm. And this is really relevant for us because we have the delivery of the parcels, which is great to have, especially in the pandemia, but with this little, we call them mosquitoes bike, that are really bad. Not only because they use also cycle paths that are where people are biking with all their lungs expanded in terms of and breathing all the pollution coming from the delivery vehicle. So I hope that companies also, at the same time that we move ahead towards making the fleet cleaner, We also take a look at the developing world, where we also need at least the fleet to comply the norm and pollute less, and also help us for us also to reach our carbon neutrality goals.
This is the ministerial mic. That one is ITF mic. Thank you very much. I think I agree with most things that have been said. But the question is, we are here now, what would be the role of ITF and so on? I think my first suggestion to ITF is that let decarbonizing not be road-based only. Let's talk transport in its totality. We have said very little about what happens in maritime, and yet maritime are some of the biggest polluters of our seas. What do we do there? We've said very little about that space. So I think firstly, ITF should consider looking at maritime. We are a big maritime country, or at least our seas provide for an opportunity for bigger maritime countries to traverse our seas, and we are affected by countries that come and pollute our seas with their oil, with their diesel, their spillages, with all what is there. So I think let's look at transport, not at road transport. And let's not concentrate on buses and Ubers, vehicles, no. Let's look at transport. What is the role of aviation in terms of polluting? You know, the regulatory framework that licenses aviation operators across our continents, across our countries, what are those? The oil producing companies or the fuel producing companies, what do we do to them? Your Shells, your Totals, your engines and so forth, your British Petroleum. These are people that at the end of the day are producing what we are trying to solve here. We are at the tail end. We are consumers of these fuels, you know. And let's look at this decarbonizing beyond electric vehicles. There are many alternative sources of energy that are out there that will be also conducive to the different types of countries and the level of economies that are there. As finance institutions, what are the blended finances that we can use to incentivize those that are going to contribute more to what we want to achieve, you know, so that there is a carrot and stick type of approach. So I think it's good progress to share where we are. We mustn't beat ourselves too much. There is good progress. But I think let's lift our eyes, let's look at transport in its totality. That's where I'll leave it. Thank you so much.
Okay, I would like to...
Use the ministerial one.
Thank you, Minister. I would like to finish with one reflection that I haven't mentioned, but I think it's very important, at least I say for Latin America. And it's for the actual, real transition. I believe it's very important to have a solution for mobility in cities. And I want to go back a little bit before electromobility. What we're finding in Latin America, with some exceptions, but still, I think there's a problem that all the cities face, is the whole transport model, the mobility. What I mean is, for the actual, how many trips the minister was saying are done now with private vehicles? If we want to do the chief avoid improved theory or paradigm, we need to give options, real options for those people, before even electrifying, for these people to move, for example, to buses. And what we find is after many years of investing in systems, in BRTs or in massive transport systems, we still haven't been able to consolidate, with some exceptions of some cities, like sustainable models. There is a lot of effort of those models to rely on fares. So a real blunt discussion about how we're going to finance these systems, and hopefully electric, has to be real in the countries. Are we doing even zero tariff? Anyway, I don't want to open that door now, but what I'm saying is before electrifying, We need to solve the financial sustainability of those systems and organize. I mean, electrifying with some of the conditions of some of our cities, with 80% of urbanization in Latin America, comes before that. It's like a condition for actually rely less on the private vehicle and go beyond the pilots. And I want to emphasize on that. I mean, we have great examples of Bogota or Santiago that are really leading the way. And now Sao Paulo is having this BRIC program. But when we talk with governments about the real solution, they all come and say, well, how are we going to pay this? How is going to the system to go operate it? How are we going to expand the system and reorganize routes? And there are lots that we can do as well at the moment before electrification to be able to walk towards that more sustainable pathway.
Thank you. This was a great conversation now, and I see 5 takeaways that can perhaps be very good lessons for countries who want to embrace this transport decarbonization agenda. I mean, the first one is think system. No, we talk about that, the holistic vision, the looking at all the modes, in order to help country to assess options. At the World Bank, we've introduced a new country diagnostic tool called the Country Climate Diagnostic Report, where we look at what are what's the policy mix, what are the options in order to get to net zero, and so that countries can decide. So think system. Second, think policies. Investments are important, but policies already matter if we want to advance this agenda. One example, for example, is we know as the North is electrifying, what will happen with all these old vehicles? And the risk is that they are going to be shipped to the South. So how do we regulate that? How do we regulate the export, the import? How do we build incentive so that this does not happen and aggravates the problem? So think policies. Third, think leapfrogging. We heard from the ministers in Chile how you leapfrogged with electric buses. Now you're thinking about green hydrogen. And to position Chile as a global leader in this new market. In South Africa, Minister, you mentioned the sustainable aviation fuel, you mentioned the maritime sector. There will be some opportunities there for growth, for jobs, as these new markets are emerging. So think leapfrogging, and then think about leveraging. How we bring the private sector, how we use more effectively our public resources to be able to leverage and bring the level of financing that is required. And finally, think about how you go to scale. And that's where the aggregation model is I think, interesting. So that was a great conversation, and thank you.
Yeah, also many thanks from me, because I think really what we do here is already what we need to do to come together into dialogue. Maybe it's not always on every detail easy, but I think on the long term, I think we all have the same goal. And when I said that we like to become global emission neutral in 2040, it means everywhere. And this is really the plan now to roll it out. It might mean different solutions, different ways of doing it, maybe country by country. As I said, we roll out now a big Uber Green product in India with 25,000 cars. So I think this is quite an amazing signal, and we are already in other places, also in the global south, with electric products. But yes, it is not easy at all, because it's not only us 5 or 6 that needs to come together and have a joint view and a compromise. It's many, many millions, billions of people that need to change also their own cars or their own ways of mobility, their own ways of commuting, and so on. And I think it's absolutely worth to do it, and happy, and thanks again having been here today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Oh, it's been a really excellent and thought-provoking discussion. So yeah, I want to thank you, and hope you'll all join me in thanking our esteemed panelists for the excellent conversation today. And we've just got some final words from Elizabeth as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for this super interesting discussion. I hope you all enjoyed the insights that we got from the stakeholders, the panelists here on stage, which represent quite different regions of the world, different functions, also business perspective, which we always strive to include as well, obviously. Maybe from the ITF's point of view, an answer to Olivia's last question, which was, how do we take this forward? Well, from the ITF side, rest assured that the DT initiative will not cease to exist anytime soon. We are going full steam ahead. We have lots of projects still going on, and we are sure there will be more coming in the future. And we really strive to provide this evidence base for policymakers with our in-house research capacities that we have. And as mentioned at the beginning of the session, one of the key flagship outputs here is the Transport Outlook. The 2023 edition is launched today, and you can find out more in the session that starts here at 11. It provides quantitative insights in what the Transport Outlook is in under different scenarios, what implications it has, how much financing it takes in order to get to the Paris Alliance pathway, and what implications does it have on governments when, for example, electric vehicles do not provide fuel tax income anymore and these kind of things. I also promise that you will find a lot of insights across all different transport subsectors. We do not only talk about road transport. The Transport Outlook and all our work also addresses aviation, maritime, active travel, and so on. So we really look at all the portfolio of transport measures, being from avoid, shift, or improve portfolio of measures that exist. And we will continue with this discussion throughout the whole summit, but beyond, definitely. And this is the second function of the ITF, not only this think tank, transport policy think tank, but also this platform that we have. And I think we have provided a good example here today, our capacity in bringing stakeholders together, providing an interesting discussion, and making sure we represent different sectors and make sure that we, this way, also contribute to this collaborative approach to making transport decarbonisation hopefully work. So thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much, Olivia, for moderating the session, and thank you very much to you all for attending and listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insights.